Well, recently we viewed a documentary film that brought together information that has been known for centuries, but with some newer findings that shoot a lot of holes in the traditional route of the Exodus. Now, we certainly are not going to solve this today. We're not going to solve what learned scholars over the ages have been unable to. However, as the Red Sea crossing and the route of the Exodus is one of the most fascinating events in the Bible, I also don't want to skip over it. So we're going to discuss that a little further today. But first of all, let's continue with Exodus chapter 13. We're going to reread the last few verses of that chapter, starting at verse 17. So, on page 74 of your complete Jewish Bible, we're going to look at Exodus 13, verse 17 to the end. Exodus 13, verse 17 to the end. After Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not guide them to the highway that goes through the land of the Plishtim, that's Philistines, because it was close by. God thought that the people, upon seeing war, might change their minds and return to Egypt. Rather, God led the people by a roundabout route through the desert by the Sea of Suf. The people of Israel went up from the land of Egypt fully armed. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the people of Israel swear an oath when he said, God will certainly remember you, and you are to carry my bones up with you away from here. They traveled from Sukkot and set up camp in Etam, at the edge of the desert. Adonai went ahead of them in a column of cloud during the daytime to lead them on their way, and at night in a column of fire to give them light. Thus they could travel both by day and by night. Neither the column of cloud by day nor the column of fire at night went away from in front of the people. Verse 18 is the beginning of the real controversy surrounding the Exodus. Because it says that instead of taking the more direct, well-marked way of the Philistines to the land of Canaan, God directed them to take a route that headed towards, depending on what your Bible version says, either the Red Sea or the Reed Sea. Now, the Hebrew word for this body of water is Yam Suf. Yam means sea, and Suf means reeds or papyrus. In the original Hebrew text, the wording is Sea of Reeds. However, in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the words are Red Sea. So this is partly where the controversy comes from. Now further, verse 18 says literally that the people went on a roundabout way to Canaan, and that this route would be the way of the wilderness. Now follow me here, because this is the first step in helping to unravel the mystery of the route of the Exodus. Just as there was a north-south, 1,000-mile-long superhighway of trade and travel that followed along the Mediterranean coastline, it was called the Way of the Philistines. There was also a 200-mile east-west trade route that was called the Way of the Wilderness. The Hebrew word used for way in both names, the Way of the Philistines, the Way of the Wilderness, is derech, and it means road or path. Why so many translators chose to make correctly the Way of the Philistines the formal name for a known trade route going from Egypt to Canaan, but they refused to accept the Way of the Wilderness as the formal name for a well-known east-west trade route across the Sinai is a mystery to me. Okay, why would so many excellent scholars intentionally make the phrase, the Way of the Wilderness, out to be some kind of a general direction rather than the precise name of a long-established ancient trade route that it is? Of course, it could be that when we recognize that rather blatant fact that sits right here before our eyes, it destroys the possibility that the traditional Christian Mount Sinai could be the place where Israel was going, because the way of the wilderness goes nowhere near the place that Constantine's mother determined in a vision was the mountain of God. Something she did in the 4th century AD, something the Jews did not agree with. Now in verse 19, we get a poignant reminder of Israel's past when it states that the Israelites took with them Joseph's bones. More accurately, they took with them Joseph's mummified body, because Genesis says he was buried in the Egyptian way, and that was mummification. But this also brings a closure to the Israelites' time in Egypt. Joseph was the beginning of that time, and Joseph laid the groundwork for Israel to come to Egypt, at first for sheer survival, then to multiply into a large nation. However, in Joseph's handling of the 7 years of abundant crops and then the 7 years of acute food shortage, the foundation would also be laid for the hatred and the subjugation of the Hebrew people. Recall, Joseph, in cooperation with the Semitic Pharaoh that ruled Egypt when Joseph was in power, took the Egyptian people's animals and crops and eventually their land and their independence away from them in payment for the stored grain necessary to survive those years of great famine. But Joseph's family, Jacob and all of his sons and families, prospered. They did quite well during this period of devastation. While the average Egyptian was suffering and losing their wealth and their freedom, Israel was multiplying and growing prosperous. The bitter jealousy of that incident, along with the exodus from Egypt, has never, even to our day, subsided among the Egyptian people. Well, as written down in Genesis 50, verse 25, Joseph made his family promise to bring him, meaning his corpse, out of Egypt when they left, because he believed God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He believed that Israel would soon be in Egypt, would only be in Egypt as sojourners, and they would not be there as permanent citizens. He knew it would be a long sojourn, 4 generations equating to about 400 years in the days of the patriarchs. But he absolutely trusted that someday, as promised by Jehovah God, they would leave. He wanted his remains to go with them. Here it states that's what they did. Now we are told that after stopping in Sukkot, where they made and ate unleavened bread, they moved on to a place called Etam, another location that has not been positively identified. Nor is the distance between Sukkot and Etam stated. We are also told that Jehovah went before them by day in a column of cloud, at night fire emitted from that cloud so it could light their pathway. Now understand, unlike what some movies claim, and is often implied in sermons and Sunday school lessons, the Lord was not acting so much like a tour guide or a scout. He wasn't taking the Israelites towards a place that they had no idea where they were going or how to get there. They knew they were going to Canaan, and the Lord told them that they couldn't take the way of the Philistines. Instead, they were to travel using the way of the wilderness. So, the route was generally established for them. Rather, Jehovah was their armed escort. He was guiding, protecting, defending, running interference before them. He was going to tell them when to move and when to stop, when to take a bit of a detour, when to get back onto the path. Isn't that a wonderful picture of how the Lord operates in our lives if we'll just follow him? But we're also given another clue we shouldn't overlook. It helps us a little bit with the route of the Exodus. It says that the appearance of the cloud and fire in it were for what reason? So they could travel by day and by night. When they first left Egypt, they moved both day and night. Why? There were a couple of reasons. First, because they needed to get as far away from Egypt as fast as they could, which also lets us know that they probably went a pretty good distance before they bumped up against the Red Sea or Reed Sea, the Yam Suf. Now, these Hebrew fugitives would never be more energetic or enthusiastic than they were immediately upon leaving Egypt. So this was the best time to put some serious distance between them and Pharaoh. But second, this is because it was late spring when they left. The desert wilderness was hot. Anyone who has lived in the desert knows that the best time to travel in a desert is at nighttime, when it's cooler, and then you rest in the daytime when it's hotter. Now let's move on to Exodus chapter 14. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 74. We're going to read all of Exodus chapter 14. Adonai said to Moshe, "Tell the people of Israel to turn around and set up camp in front of Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-Zephon. Camp opposite it, by the sea. The Pharaoh will say that the people of Israel are wandering aimlessly in the countryside. The desert has closed in on them. I will make Pharaoh so hard-hearted that he will pursue them. Thus I will win glory for myself at the expense of Pharaoh and all of his army. And the Egyptians will realize at last, I am Adonai." The people did as ordered. And when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart towards the people, and they said, "What have we done, letting Israel stop being our slaves?" So he prepared his chariots, and he took his people with him. He took 600 first-quality chariots, as well as the other chariots in Egypt, along with their commanders. Adonai made Pharaoh hard-hearted, and he pursued the people of Israel as they left boldly. The Egyptians went after them, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, with his cavalry and army, and he overtook them as they were encamped by the sea, by Pi-Hahiroth, in front of Baal-Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the people of Israel looked up, and they saw the Egyptians right there coming after them. In great fear, the people of Israel cried out to Adonai and said to Moses, "Was it because there weren't enough graves in Egypt that you brought us out to die in the desert? Why have you done this to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we tell you in Egypt to let us alone? We'll just go on being slaves for the Egyptians. It would be better for us to be the Egyptians' slaves than to die in the desert." And Moses answered the people, "Stop being so fearful. Remain steady, and you will see how Adonai is going to save you. He will do it today. Today you have seen the Egyptians, but you will never see them again. Adonai will do battle for you. Just calm yourselves down." Well, Adonai asked Moshe, "Why are you crying to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift your staff, reach out your hand over the sea, and divide it into two. The people of Israel will advance into the sea on dry ground. Now, as for me, I will make the Egyptians hard-hearted. They will march in after them. Thus I will win glory for myself at the expense of Pharaoh and all of his army, chariots, and cavalry. And then the Egyptians will realize that I'm Adonai when I've won myself glory at the expense of Pharaoh, his chariots, and his cavalry." Well, next, the angel of God, who was going ahead of the camp of Israel, moved away and went behind them. And the column of cloud moved away from in front of them and stood behind them. It stationed itself between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel, where there was cloud and darkness here, but light by night there, so that the one did not come near the other all night long. Moshe reached out his hand over the sea, and Adonai caused the sea to go back before a strong east wind all night. He made the sea become dry land. Its water was divided into two. Then the people of Israel went into the sea on the dry ground, with the water piled up for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians continued their pursuit, going after them into the sea, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and cavalry. And just before dawn, Adonai looked out on the Egyptian army through the column of fire and cloud and threw them into a panic. He caused the wheels of their chariots to break off so that they could move only with difficulty. The Egyptians said, Adonai is fighting for Israel against the Egyptians. Let's get away from them. And Adonai said to Moses, reach out your hand over the sea. The water will return and cover the Egyptians with their chariots and cavalry. Moses reached out his hand over the sea, and by dawn the sea had returned to its former depth. The Egyptians tried to flee, but Adonai swept them into the sea. The water came back and covered all the chariots and cavalry of Pharaoh's army who had followed them into the sea. Not even one of them was left. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground in the sea with the water walled up for them on their right and their left. On that day, Adonai saved Israel from the Egyptians. Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the shore. And when Israel saw the mighty deed that Adonai had performed against the Egyptians, the people feared Adonai. And they believed Adonai and in his servant, Moshe. That has got to be one of the great scenes in all the Bible. Now, after viewing that video, I hope you're all here to see it, of the Exodus crossing in the mountain of God, I hope the stage is now well set for moving into matters of chapter 14. I think enough was covered in that video. We don't have to spend too much time going over details that involve, to a degree, speculation. Chapter 14 opens with Jehovah giving Moses an instruction. Turn back and encamp at a place called Pi-hahirot, which means mouth of the channel, or in this case, mouth of the gorge. And we learn that this Pi-hahirot was at the edge of the Red Sea. What the plain language of these opening verses tell us is the Israelites were heading in one direction, but then God had them turn around and backtrack somewhat and go into a different direction altogether. Now, what would result is that the Pharaoh heard the Israelites were wandering aimlessly in the desert wilderness, that is in the Sinai Peninsula. First question, how is it that Pharaoh would know where they were going and where they were at any given time? Undoubtedly, the Pharaoh had instructed the commanders of the military outposts that Egypt operated throughout the Sinai that they were to follow the Israelites and report back. This would have been an easy task. Come on, you don't hide a horde of 3 million people, hundreds of thousands of animals walking along dusty trails. I mean, rest assured, they were not blazing a new trail. They were taking the well-known routes, and even a detour would have been awfully easy to detect. So as the Israelites took that same route across the Sinai that Moses used to flee from Egypt to Midian some 40 years earlier, it was a very simple task for Egyptian scouts to follow and report the route of the Israelites back to the Pharaoh. Reporting back to Pharaoh was accomplished probably via smoke signals, signal fires reflecting light off of shiny objects. They did all those different systems back then. And these systems of sending messages across large distances had been in use for centuries prior to the Exodus. It was nothing new. It wouldn't have taken but a very few hours for a scout following the Israelites to have had his message relayed and then put into the hands of the Pharaoh. What we need to understand is that as far as Pharaoh knew, Israel was only going to be gone for 3 days in order for the entire nation of Israel to meet together and sacrifice to God. And Pharaoh never trusted that to be the case. In my career in the corporate world, I learned many interesting insights into human behavior, my own included. And one of those is that what a person tends to suspect of others primarily comes from within the framework of what their own thoughts and behaviors are. That is, if a person is cunning and manipulative, they tend to fear that others might be cunning and manipulative of them. If they are by nature people who aren't true to their word, their fear is others will not be true to their word. Pharaoh knew what he'd do if he was in Moses' shoes, asking for his people to leave. So Pharaoh suspected that Moses would say whatever he had to say. Don't worry, Pharaoh, we're just going out in the wilderness for 3 days. We'll be right back. And that was in order to get what he wanted. In this case, it was to get the people of Israel completely free from Egypt. Now, I don't think Pharaoh ever really believed that this was going to be a short 3-day holiday, which is why he risked the well-being of his nation in an unwinnable battle with God. Of course, in the end, he was right, wasn't he? The other thing we need to know is that the Sinai Peninsula was Egyptian-held territory. Much like Alaska was U.S. territory before it became a state, the Sinai wasn't a part of Egypt proper, but it was controlled by Egypt. Alaska was important to the U.S. for 2 reasons. It was a source of natural resources, oil, and as a strategic military buffer between North America and the Soviet Union. Again, it was the same for the Sinai. The Sinai was mined by Egypt as a source of copper, and it provided a rather substantial geographic buffer between Egypt and the Middle Eastern nations that were constantly trying to gain the upper hand over one another and over Egypt. So until Israel had crossed over the Sinai, either onto the Arabian Peninsula to the east or to the land of Canaan to the north, they were still on Egyptian territory, and this made them vulnerable. Now, this was, of course, why Pharaoh was free to send his soldiers after Israel, because if Sinai had been controlled by some other nation, well, the presence of Egyptian soldiers would have meant war with whatever nation was claiming control of it. In verse 3, the word came back to Pharaoh that Israel seemed to be confused in their route. Now they were closed in by the wilderness. Now, these are not euphemisms. Wherever Israel was, they were traveling through a landscape that had them closed in, a place that, from a strategic military point of view, had them trapped. Now, what kind of terrain could trap the Israelites? Well, certainly not flat, open desert expanses. If you remember that video, we saw that this could only be something like a large gorge, a dry waterway that had cut through the rocky hills on the eastern part of the Sinai Peninsula. It had to be a route that had one way in, one way out. No ability to escape in any other direction. Now, this is not speculation. For certain, this was the case, because the book of Exodus plainly says so. Any legitimate speculation only concerns where exactly that place was. Now, we are reminded in verse 4 of something that is a constant theme of Exodus. It is that one of the primary purposes of God striking Egypt in all manner was so that he would be glorified, and that the Egyptians would know that it was Jehovah who had the power to do these things. Pharaoh is now informed of what he had suspected all along. Israel was well on its way to permanent relocation. Now, of course, this infuriated Pharaoh because he felt duped. Obviously, he had held out the barely flickering hope that Israel would return after 3 days. He really didn't want to risk another round with Moses and with God. Yet simply by the amount of time Israel was gone and the direction of their route, it was evident they weren't coming back. So he sent his army after the Israelites. Now, was it that Pharaoh meant to destroy Israel? No. Certainly as retribution and a demonstration of his control, he would have killed thousands of them. But his goal was to get them back to Egypt, back into slave labor and servitude to him. I mean, we're told that not only did he send some sort of special division of 600 chariots after the Hebrews, but also other divisions of every kind of chariots. Archaeology and Egyptology have shown that Egypt used different kinds of chariots in what was very likely what's known as the 18th dynasty period. This was characterized by using a variety of 4- and 6-spoke chariot wheels. This unusual use of 2 different types of chariot wheels occurred only during a very narrow slice of history in Egypt. And that was during the generally accepted time of the Exodus, around the 14th century BC. And we're also told that the Pharaoh himself went with his army. Now, let's not overlook a vital ingredient to Pharaoh giving chase to Israel. Jehovah hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now, we've encountered this before. Why would Jehovah do that? To draw the Egyptians to destruction. That was his plan. After the Egyptian army is destroyed at the Red Sea, it's going to be 300 years before we hear them troubling Egypt again. This drawing of Pharaoh to destruction like a moth to a flame is a pattern that's going to repeat at Armageddon. It was utterly senseless for this Pharaoh to take this suicidal action. I mean, his own magicians and sorcerers over and over again said, this God is just too strong for them. But Pharaoh was so blinded with rage and with pride, with hatred, that he went against all wisdom. Some of that hatred was caused by Pharaoh's own evil inclination. But some was also caused by the Lord so that his purposes would be achieved. Well, now it's time to fast forward to an era that I'm reasonably certain is literally just around the corner. Now, I don't know if this time is a month from now. I don't know if it's a year from now. I don't know if it's 10 years or more. But I have little doubt that most of us in this room will live to see the events talked about in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. Because we are in the midst of watching Ezekiel's prophecy of Ezekiel 36 and 37 occur as I speak. So please, open your Bibles to Ezekiel chapter 38. Ezekiel chapter 38. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's going to be on page 692. Ezekiel chapter 38. We are going to read from 38, verse 1 to 39, verse 8. The word of Adonai came to me, human being, turn your face towards Gog of the land of Magog, chief prince of Meshech and Tuval, and prophesy against him. Say that Adonai Elohim says, I'm against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tuval. I will turn you around and put hooks in your jaw and bring you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all completely equipped, a great horde with breastplates and shields, all wielding swords. Paras, Ethiopia, and Put are with them, all with breastplates and helmets. Gomer, with all its troops. The house of Togarmah, with the far reaches of the north, with all of its troops. Many peoples are with you. Prepare yourself, get ready, you all your crowd gathered around you, and take charge of them. After many days have passed, you will be mustered for service. In later years, you will invade the land which has been brought back which has been brought back with the sword, gathered out of many peoples the mountains of Israel. They had been lying in ruins for a long time. But now Israel's been extracted from the peoples, and all of them are living there securely. You will come up like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your troops, and many other peoples with you. Adonai Elohim says, when that day comes, thoughts will well up in your mind, and you will devise a sinister scheme. You will say, I'm going to invade this land of unwalled villages. I will take by surprise these people who are at peace, living securely, all in places without walls, bars, or gates. I will seize the spoil and take the plunder. You will attack the former ruins that are now inhabited. Come against the people gathered from the nations, who have acquired livestock and other wealth and are living in the central parts of the land. Sheva, Dedan, all the leading merchants of Tarshish will ask you, have you come to seize the spoil? Have you assembled your hordes to loot, to carry off silver, gold, livestock, and other wealth, to take much plunder? Therefore, human being, prophesy. You tell Gog that Adonai Elohim says this, won't you be aware of it when my people in Israel are living in security? You will choose just that time to come from your place in the far reaches of the north, you and many peoples with you, all of them on horseback, a huge horde, a mighty army, and you will invade my people Israel like a cloud covering the land. This will be in the Acharit Hayamim, the world to come, rather the end times. End times. That's what this is talking about. Later days, latter days. And I will bring you against my land so that the Goyim will know me. When before their eyes, I'm set apart as holy through you, Gog. And Adonai Elohim says, I spoke of you long ago through my servants, the prophets of Israel. Back then they prophesied for many years that I would have you invade them. And when that day comes, when Gog invades the land of Israel, says Adonai Elohim, my furious anger will boil up. In my jealousy and my heated fury I speak. When that day comes, there will be a great earthquake in the land of Israel, so that the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, the wild beasts, all the reptiles creeping on the ground, every human being living there in the land will tremble before me. Mountains will fall, cliffs will crumble, every wall will crash to the ground. I will summon a sword against him throughout all my mountains, says Adonai Elohim. Every man will wield his sword against his brother. I will judge him with a plague and with blood. I will cause torrential rains to fall on him, his troops and the many peoples with him, along with huge hailstones, fire, and sulfur. I will show my greatness and my holiness, making myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they'll know that I am Adonai. On to chapter 39. So, you, human being, prophesy against Gog. Say that Adonai Elohim says, I'm against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Duval. I will turn you around, lead you on, and bring you from the far reaches of the north against the mountains of Israel. But then I'll knock your bow out of your left hand and make your arrows drop from your right hand. You will fall on the mountains of Israel, you, your troops, and all the peoples with you. I will give you to be eaten up by all kinds of birds of prey and wild animals. You will fall in the open field, for I have spoken, says Adonai Elohim. I will also send fire against Magog and against those living securely in the coastlands. Then they will know that I'm Adonai. I will make my holy name known among my people Israel. I will not allow my holy name to be profaned any longer. Then the Gentiles will know I am Adonai, the Holy One in Israel. Yes, this is coming. It will be done, says Adonai Elohim. This is the day about which I have spoken. The pattern of the Lord literally baiting those marked for destruction into battle against his people. A battle in which the Lord, by his supernatural might, will defeat the enemy is repeated right here in Ezekiel. Just as Pharaoh was so obsessed with Israel that all reason was thrown to the wind, so will all these nations mentioned in these verses of Ezekiel not be able to control themselves. Between their own evil thoughts and their plans, and the Lord setting their plans into their minds like concrete, destruction is their destiny. It is guaranteed. Please see the bittersweet truth in this. The Lord will mark some for life and some for death. Some will be a ransom for others. The Lord will make distinctions and he will choose sides. He will sacrifice those who do not belong to him for the sake of those who do. Now, while on the one hand, it is his will that all are saved, on the other hand, he knows who will be and who won't be. Those who won't be saved will be hardened in such a way as to essentially commit mass suicide on an unimaginable scale by going against the Lord God at Armageddon. Now consider this. Who in our world today loves death so much that they would happily die? Who would joyfully see their children strap bombs onto their tiny bodies and their entire nation be decimated if it also meant destroying God's people, Israel, in the process? The Muslims. The core group of those who will lead the unbelieving world into self-destruction has been revealed if we'll just open our eyes. It is Islam. Certainly Russia, and its completely godless society, possibly China, also with a society based upon rejection of any spiritual reality, will be part of this great battle for their own good reasons. But it is Islam that has nearly a limitless supply of petrodollars and of people who are anxious to martyr themselves and their families in suicide bombings and a battle simply to destroy any last vestige of Israel, and don't kid yourself, of Judeo-Christianity. Pharaoh knew exactly where to find the Israelites. They were going to be camped at the very seashore spot that Jehovah had led them. Now, it must have been just before sunset that the Hebrew watchmen spotted the Egyptian army in the distance, and they flew into hysteria. People being people, naturally, the first thing they did was to find somebody to blame. Moses. They sarcastically confront him, wanting to know if the only reason he brought them out here is because there wasn't sufficient amount of cemetery space back in Egypt. If Moses didn't know before he left Egypt, he knows now that in the unlikely event they survive Pharaoh's army, this group of people wasn't going to bring him very much joy. They were whiners, ungrateful, of little faith or courage. I mean, can't you just, I can't. Can't you just picture Moses standing in front of the elders of the people as they point those bony, withered fingers at him, reminding him they never really wanted to leave Egypt in the first place? I mean, after all, slavery's not that bad, right? I mean, better to serve Pharaoh and survive than to die a painful death. In translation, better to serve the evil that we're familiar with, live the life we're comfortable with, than to follow God in faith into what seems like uncertainty. Moses is just not shaken by this. He fires right back at them. Don't be afraid. Stand fast. You're going to see God's deliverance of you today. Moses goes to God. And he tells Moses, so why do you cry out to me? I mean, is Jehovah irritated that Moses approached him with a problem? Of course not. It's as though God fully expects Moses to already know that the first step of any problem is keep moving forward. Don't stop. Go forward. God will make a way. Alfred Edersheim says in his tremendous work, The History of the Old Testament, there are times when even prayer seems of itself to represent unbelief, and only to go forward in calm assurance. That's our duty. I say amen to that. Balaam kept wanting to go back to God, hoping he'd get a different answer. One more in line with what he wanted. We find ourselves in challenging situations that seem to result from doing the very thing that only hours earlier we were so confident was a God-ordained action. Suddenly, an unexpected choice confronts us, and now we wonder, do we go forward or do we pause? Of course, going to God in prayer can't ever be a poor choice. But apparently when our duty before God is already crystal clear, we are to go forward as we pray. This is as opposed to stopping and rethinking whether or not we should have ever begun this journey in the first place. Now notice an interesting response by God. In verse 16, he tells Moses, hold your staff high and stretch out your hand. Just as back in Egypt, when Moses spoke, he spoke with God's authority. Remember earlier where God told Moses that when Moses spoke, it was as if God spoke. Moses was already empowered with God's power to do what was necessary to carry out God's will. This as contrasted with verse 17 when God says, but I will make Pharaoh's heart hard. God empowers us for whatever tasks he gives to us, no more and no less than needed. Of course, we never hold within us more than the tiniest fraction of the infinite power that is Jehovah God. Some things he reserves strictly for himself. God never asks Moses to do the thing that God and God alone has determined is going to be his sole doing, changing a heart for the good or the bad. When we're going about the business of spreading the gospel, we need to keep that in mind. God has never and will never empower any of us with the ability to change a human heart. We can't soften a heart, and we can't harden a heart. Our job isn't to convert anybody. Our job is just to speak and then demonstrate with our lives the truth of the gospel of Christ. The rest is up to him. Next, we're told in verse 19 that the messenger of God changed position from leading Israel to being stationed between Israel and the Egyptian army. In almost every instance in Exodus 14 that our Bibles say the Lord or God or Adonai, in fact, the original Hebrew is God's personal name, Yehovah. Only a couple of times in this entire chapter do we find a reference to God as anything other than Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yehovah. And here we encounter one of those times. The Hebrew that is translated angel of God or messenger of God most of the time is Malach Elohim, or Melach Yehovah. In this verse, the Malach Elohim, the angel of God, is clearly identified as that cloud that was leading Israel. Sometime later, this visible presence of God would rest over the Holy of Holies in the wilderness tabernacle. There, it is called the Shekinah, or as we typically call it, the glory of God. So, what do we know about this cloud, this presence of God that has been leading Israel, but now it suddenly moves to divide the camp of Israel from the camp of Egypt? More precisely, we find that God is being a hedge of protection around Israel. We're told something that should be quite familiar to us now in verse 20. It is that the cloud gave what to the Egyptians and what to Israel? Darkness to Egypt, light to Israel. The same cloud. Darkness to Egypt, light to Israel. Now remember our Hebrew lesson back in Genesis 1, where God created darkness and light. And that the words chosen really weren't about daytime and nighttime, or about visual light or visual darkness. The Hebrew word used for darkness there is choshech, a very negative word. It denotes a type of blindness or evil or an obstructing force, a spiritual darkness. For light, the Hebrew is or, which refers to illumination, a positive spiritual force, something that emits truth and goodness. Now, these terms aim towards something that is far more than merely the presence or absence of a visible light, like from a light bulb or from an oil lamp or even from a star that is at the center of our own solar system, the star we call the sun. We saw those terms again in Exodus as part of the description of the 9th stroke or plague upon Egypt. When Egypt was plunged into horrifying 3 days of what? Spiritual darkness. At the same time, the Israelites up in the land of Goshen were experiencing enlightenment or illumination. God's light, His goodness, was showering down upon His people. Here we see these same two terms again. Once again, God has put choshech upon Egypt, meaning Pharaoh's armies, or upon the camp of Israel. But what is kind of startling, if we think about it, is that both this spiritual darkness and spiritual light are coming from the same source. From this cloud, this angel of God, this almost impossible to explain presence of God. On the one hand comes darkness for some, on the other hand, light for His people. For those who oppose Him, darkness and death. For those who are His own, light and life. This is not an image of God that we're used to seeing, and frankly, many of us aren't very comfortable with it. Some like to say, well, yeah, but that's the Old Testament. See, the Old Testament God's different from the New Testament God. No, my God's not. We're reminded scores of times in the Old and New Testament that God never changes. There is no shadow of turning in Him. What we must keep in mind is that Jehovah has determined what belonging to Him means. How's that defined? And what it does not. Whether in the past, present, or future, what is not His will be eternally destroyed. What is His will be eternally existent and present with Him. There's no in between. There's no appeasement. There's no compromise. There's no neutrality. There's no changing His mind. And by the way, let's explore just what changing means when we're referring to God. His never changing is referring to his attributes and his character, as reflected in his principles and in his governing dynamics. It is not changing if he grants you a healing from a disease, but he doesn't grant one to me. It is not changing that God instructed Joshua to kill or drive out all those who occupied the land that he set aside for his people, but does not instruct Jesus to drive out and kill the Romans who occupied the Holy Lands. It's a matter of timing. In fact, at a prescribed time in history, Yeshua will not only drive out and kill all those who have no place in the land of God, he will destroy all of those worldwide who oppose God, even if only in their hearts, in a great battle that we call Armageddon. Well, now in verse 21 comes one of the, if not the most, dramatic moments in the entire Bible, the parting of the Red Sea. Israel's trapped on an enormous beach. The Yam Suf on the one side, the Egyptians on the other, and they see their destination of refuge on the other side of these impassable waters, but there's no natural means to even get there. Israel braces for the worst, and they begin to mourn because they know that it's going to be death for some and a return to slavery for the remainder. But the Lord is going to make a way where there is no way. Moses stretches out his hand, and the process of dividing the deep sea that blocks the Israelites begins. An east wind begins to blow. Now, please remember, back to our first day together, many months ago, years ago for some, when I told you to watch out for the word east. Whenever you see the word east, underline it. Because you're going to find that east always has significant spiritual implications. And often it involves the presence of God or a miracle. Now, all night the east wind blows, the waters split. The sea bottom is dried, it's made firm and passable for 3 million refugees sitting trapped on the beach at the other side of the sea to cross over. Now, I'm convinced that this great horde was about to pass through what we today call the Gulf of Aqaba. Let us now and forever put to rest the liberal and secular notion that if the Exodus happened at all, that the Hebrews crossed over a shallow mud flat back up on the edge of the land of Goshen. Because if that's true, then the biblical account of the Exodus is a gross exaggeration at the least, or a fantasy at the worst. We are told in the Torah that walls of water built up on their right and on their left, and that after the Israelites walked through this dried sea bottom, that the Egyptians pursued, and the waters returned, and it drowned every last Egyptian soldier. It must have been that the Israelites crossed in the wee hours of the morning before daybreak. Otherwise, the Egyptians, even from a distance, would have seen all this happening. It was a several-hour journey for all those people to get across. A distance of around 8 miles. But once his people were safely on the other side, God suddenly broke his light upon the darkness that had entangled and immobilized Egypt for several hours and kept them from attacking Israel. And as the Egyptians realized what had happened, and they set out in hot pursuit of Israel, something threw a panic into them. They were so terrified that the soldiers determined to flee for their lives, because it says in verse 25, Jehovah makes war for them, for Israel, against Egypt. Egypt now knew God's glory, but not one lived to tell about it. The scene here is a shadow, it's a type, it's a pattern of what is going to happen in those last moments of this present world when the darkness, this ever-deepening shroud of evil that pervades it, that rules over it, will become darker and darker. Then suddenly, when only a few are expecting it, all will be plunged into a heavenly light. Satan, his demons, and all that belong to him will not be able to stand in the light of God's presence. We've all heard that statement about Satan and his demons being unable to stand in the light of holiness. But perhaps what we haven't quite realized is just what that means, which is this. It is that those in union with darkness will be burned up by that same light that those who have come out of the darkness into union in Christ will be saved by. As an aside, it says not one of Pharaoh's men survived. Did Pharaoh die here along with his troops? We're not told. Many think he did. There is some evidence in Egyptian historical documents that during the supposed time period of the Exodus, the Pharaoh died, and Egypt went into a terrible decline that lasted for decades. It's not explained as to just why this Pharaoh's death and the sudden collapse of Egypt were tied together. But if indeed this was referring to the Pharaoh of the Exodus, it would explain a lot. Egypt, now without its leader and the rightful heir to the throne, having died during Passover night, along with a quarter of the population of Egypt leaving all at once, no wonder Egypt collapsed. This chapter concludes with the words that Israel saw all that God did and they held him in awe. But it also says that they had a change in heart. And in addition to trusting God, they also trusted Moses. We're talking the Israelites. Unfortunately, that was just for a time, because it wouldn't be but just a few more days before they lost faith again and all the whining and all the doubt resurfaced. God's people haven't changed a whole lot in 3,500 years, have we? I don't think so. Well, we'll continue with Exodus and the wilderness journey next time.
Yeshua.